Our fourth largest city, Houston, shouldn't be vulnerable to this kind of flooding. We shouldn't have a housing development with 40,000 people in it, the overwhelming percentage of whom are Hispanic and African American, that are in mortal danger, run out of their homes every time we have a major storm, even storms much less severe than this.
Spieckerman meeting at President and CEO Lee Spieckerman here. What do you think of that, Lee?
Here's to me what it laid bare. First of all, this started a year ago when Colin Kaepernick sat for the national anthem. Where was Roger Goodell? Roger Goodell should have convened a summit of owners, of players, of community leaders. We also have a huge issue with racial division in this country. We have a desperate need for African-American advancement and real policies on that. The other thing that it's laid bare is that, frankly, a lot of white people, unfortunately, just don't want to talk about these issues. They don't know what it's like to be black in America. When you've got Tim Scott, a conservative Republican African-American senator from one of the reddest states in the country, South Carolina, getting on the Senate floor and saying that he has been stopped repeatedly because he's African-American.
In the course of 1 year, I've been stopped 7 times by law enforcement officers. Not 4, not 5, not 6, but 7 times in 1 year as an elected official.
That tells you something's wrong. He's not exactly a lefty or a race baiter. Middle-income Americans have had stagnant or declining real incomes over the past 20 years. The overwhelming reason for that is the deindustrialization of America caused by these horrific trade deals that have been made, which has also decimated the African-American middle class in northern industrial cities. That was the ladder to the middle class for African-Americans that fled the Jim Crow South after World War II.
All right.
And here, after one generation, because of this deindustrialization, we decimated our inner cities. We have a middle class that is about to go off a financial cliff. And this is particularly bad for African Americans and Hispanics who disproportionately populate the restaurant and hospitality industry. Many of them are young people on their first rung of their career ladder. They are absolutely desperate. So we're looking at literally tens of millions of middle class Americans about to enter a dystopian existence if we don't move quickly. And I think the entire package, Neil, probably needs to be $3 trillion to $4 trillion.
As white people, we don't get to declare the end of racism. As I tweeted some time ago, when the vast majority of African Americans believe racism is no longer a problem, then, and only then, will I believe that racism is no longer a problem. And how do we know racism is still a problem in our country? African Americans have 5 times the incarceration rate of white Americans, 3 times the poverty rate of white Americans. For every $100 of wealth white Americans have, African Americans only have $5. Now, all too many white people, whether they say it out loud or not, believe that these horrific statistics are due to some immutable deficiency among African Americans. Well, first of all, I'd say that those white people need to spend a whole lot more time with a whole lot more black people. But also, they're obviously glossing over the reality that black people are not just the descendants of another American immigrant group. Now, to be sure, few immigrants to this country had it easy, and throughout our history, many immigrants were horribly mistreated. But only African Americans were subjected to 250 years of slavery. Slavery in the country that extolled itself as the exemplar of freedom, democracy, and decency. Think about that. It's crazy. And then when the 13th Amendment was finally ratified, releasing African Americans from the bondage of slavery, for the next century, African Americans endured heinous oppression, wanton terrorism, incessant humiliation, unceasing marginalization. Had any other subset of the American population been a product of that sordid racial history, if any other group was still mired in the vestiges of that oppressive system, no rational person would ascribe its relatively disadvantaged status to a lack of ability or will. What if we took some of those babies born in Winnetka, Illinois, or the Upper East Side of New York, or Highland Park, Texas, and had them raised in these cauldrons of privation and dysfunction that are America's inner cities? Let's see how well they turn out in that environment. So should white people today feel guilty for the sins and crimes that previous generations of white people committed against African Americans? No, I don't think they should feel guilty for that. But white people today should feel guilty if they don't do everything in their power to promote African American advancement. Not just because it's what God would want us to do. Not just because it's what fulfilling the American spirit requires us to do, but because nothing less is acceptable in a great country. It is simply beneath our standard to allow the status quo to continue. White people need to quit deluding themselves into believing that just because we have laws banning discrimination against African Americans, racism is basically over. That's crazy talk. I don't know any intelligent white person who's honest with themselves that won't at least admit to themselves, that when they see African Americans, they generally, at least in the back of their minds, see the negative stereotypes. Hopefully, if they actually know and work with and have friends who are African Americans, they see a lot more positives. But those negative stereotypes, those horrible images that have been nurtured by white racists and the white power structure over 200 years in our country, unfortunately are there. And that does hold African American people back. In just the past few weeks, we've had some tragic situations involving African Americans in our country. Ahmaud Arbery was a jogger who was shot by two white men, one a former police officer, because they alleged he was a suspect in a string of burglaries. Turns out there hadn't been any burglaries in that neighborhood in 2 months. Breonna Taylor was in her home completely innocent. There was a no-knock warrant from the police. It was a mistaken identity, and they shot her multiple times and killed her. We had a president of a homeowners association basically hold a delivery driver, African-American delivery driver, captive because they thought he might be a criminal. We had a Federal Express driver in a neighborhood that was accosted by a homeowner and treated like he was a marauding burglar. He had a Federal Express uniform on, a Federal Express truck. These are just a few incidents in just the past few weeks that highlight that we have a terrible problem with race in our country. Okay, we've put laws on the books banning discrimination. Now we're seeing what remains about the white mindset, about structural impediments that are the vestiges of conscious racist policies that the white power structures of the past put in place. We have to acknowledge that. Inner city youngsters, disproportionately African American, are relegated to the worst K through 12 education system in the developed world. These children didn't choose their zip codes. They didn't determine where they were going to be born and what neighborhoods they were going to live in, and yet they are tethered to these schools. Those young African American children are going to be growing up with our children. Do we want them working with our children, building a better world, adding wealth to our country, or do we want them to be relegated to the social welfare system and the criminal justice system, or both? When you have cauldrons of privation and dysfunction in our inner cities, no good middle-class jobs, or very few of them, low incomes, poor education, high dropout rates, so you have a lot of teenagers that are not going to school and are out and about during the day. Of course, you're going to have much more crime. You're going to have much more drug abuse, alcohol abuse, domestic violence. That would be true of any people group, but that merely reinforces the stereotype and enables white people to rationalize the negative perceptions they have about African Americans. I mean, that's a terrible, vicious cycle that we have got to get over in our country. And frankly, if this were happening to white people, it would be a national catastrophe. We would not allow it to continue. And I bring this up not just because I love black people, but because I love America. And this racial disparity, the racial divide we have in our country, is corrosive. Our enemies could not deploy a more effective weapon in our country than the racial situation that we have right now. So this goes beyond altruism. It's practicality. We have got to do much better when it comes to bringing African Americans into the mainstream, into the middle class. What's amazing to me is, with all of the impediments that they have faced for 300 years in our country, how well African Americans have done in our country, how many have succeeded in all walks of life. It's truly inspirational, but not nearly as many African Americans are doing as well as they could be or should be. We have to have a plan. And the fact that our government has spent trillions of dollars over the past 60 years trying to alleviate poverty and supposedly trying to help African Americans does not mean that nothing can work, just because those programs have not worked nearly as well as they were supposed to. That's kind of like saying I spent a ton of money on a quack doctor and he didn't cure me, so I guess nothing will work. Well, how about going out and getting a doctor who's not a quack? Let me lay out what some of the provisions of that plan might include.